Tonight we're discussing the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, and we'll be discussing why the UK Climate Change Act is not enough and why we're demanding that Parliament and the government goes further. And we'll also be looking at some of the nitty-gritty of the bill. For instance, we've got Robert here from BioWatch, who will be discussing certain aspects of the bill that they have particular interest in. But, so our first speaker is going to be Sarah Lunnan of the Climate and Emergency Bill Alliance. And after that, we have Robert Holgrave from Biofuel Watch to give you their take on the CEE bill. And they'll both speak for 15 minutes, and then we want questions from you. Now, the first part of this, the first half hour, goes out on YouTube, but the rest of the session, where you can ask whatever you want, and if Sarah, as Sarah was saying, maybe even do a bit of workshopping of what you could do with your MP, that won't be going out. So say whatever you want, ask whatever you want. There'll be plenty, there should be plenty of time for everybody to be heard. So without further ado, I'm going to Sarah and to kick us off about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Really nice to see some faces I haven't seen for a long time. So yeah, that's always pleasant. So I'm going to talk a little bit to a script, and then really happy, as I said before, to answer any questions. So we've got an issue. We've known, well, our governments have accepted, national governments, global governments have accepted since 1990 that we have to do something about climate change. And there's also been a dawning realisation that we have to do something about the devastating loss of our wildlife and the ecological systems that ultimately we are utterly dependent upon. But even as we accept that we have to do something, we've actually carried on making the situation worse. So, you know, I can't remember exactly what the figure is, but a massive percentage of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have been put in since 1990. Since the 1970s, we've lost, in this country, almost 70% of our wildlife. So even as we accept the need to do something about it, we are carrying on with those processes that ultimately destroy what we need to live on. And representational democracies are not well placed to deal with emergencies. And you can make a very good argument that oppositional, first past the post representational democracies are the worst system of government to deal with the gradual, cumulative, distributed dangers that we are now facing from the breakdown of our natural world. And what the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill does, it seeks to use levers of government power that already exist to protect the future of life on Earth. And if it was law, it would require a number of things. One, a communication about the current precarious situation we find ourselves in. And it was very noticeable from the Climate Assembly, although there were very obvious limitations about that particular exercise. But what came back from the people who participated in that was they said, I did not know. You know, I did not know it was this bad. Why has nobody told us? And their main recommendation was a process of that the government should publicise and let us know exactly what the situation is that we are in. They felt it was so dangerous, it was so extreme. Surely they would have been told. How could we not be told about the situation we face? So the CE bill requires the communication about that. Accepting where we are and then mobilising for the result which is needed, not what is politically credible. So our current political system delivers what is politically credible, and it sets competing policies against each other and then determines which is the most important. And so what has happened in the last 30 years is that our ecology and our climate crisis has been treated as a competing policy, as likely to be put down as picked up. And what the CE bill does, what the bill does, is it seeks to make those two crises, which are either side of the two sides of a single coin, it seeks to make those crises the lens and the framework through which government will then have to view every other policy. So they stop being policies to pick up or put down, and they start being the lens through which the government makes policies. The bill's been drawn up with input from a number of respected academics, from earth sciences, ecology, and democratic studies. So we pulled in some real academic heavyweights. And we say the profs have provided the academic gravitas. The establishment push is now coming from the 95 MPs who've signed up. And what we now need is the alliance of people on the ground at constituency level to help deliver the public mandate to get those other MPs on board. And once there's enough of them, the government has to take notice of Parliament. And that's what happened with the 2008 Climate Change Act. It started its life as a presentation bill, and it ended up becoming an act of Parliament. So when you get told by your MPs, it's just a presentation bill, it's not going anywhere, you can point to the 2008 Climate Change Act, which was at the time one of the most radical pieces of legislation passed by the British government, and it was groundbreaking at the time. So you can point to that. If your MP gets on board, they can help make the change that's needed. We do actually have on the website a number of frequently asked questions and a number of common rebuttals to help you respond to those set pieces that you get from MPs. So the Tories have a set response, the Labour Party will have a set response. And in a way, it's partly the political parties taking the bill and the campaign seriously that they realise that they have got to look at the bill and start having some pushback against it, because it is beginning to gather ground and it is beginning to make an impact. So the current legislation and the current targets, if we look at them in a little bit of detail, at the moment, the government has a target of achieving net zero by 2050. And what the bill does is it says it's not about a zero target, zero carbon by a certain date. What we have to do is stay within the carbon budget. So the IPCC has a number of ways of calculating the carbon budget depending on what probability you want to accept for keeping that all below 1.5, and also depending on your stomach for inflating that budget by bringing nets into the equation, like borrowing carbon from the future and spending it now in the belief that we can suck it out of the atmosphere or suck it out of the fossil fuels that we're burning for energy in the future. The bill says you can't do that. You're going to reduce emissions and energy emissions. You have to stay within the 1.5 budget, and you expand your budget based on nets because frankly they don't exist. And Kevin Anderson has referred to it as an unjust high stakes gamble with our children's future, and we think he's right. We know that why 1.5 and why the budget? Well, it's been accepted and the argument's been had, and our governments have accepted that figure. So in a way, that argument has been won. We don't have to argue for 1.5. And we do know that over 1.5, if the temperature increases over that, it really is a very grave risk that we're taking with our future. And even at 1.5, and I think this is not particularly well accepted by politicians, we face fundamental changes to the way that we're going to live in the future, if we're lucky. So 1.5 is not a get out of jail free card. Anyway, I'm in danger of preaching to the choir on that one, so I'll move on. The current Committee on Climate Change's plan for 2050 is basically a roll of the dice. If you go to page 11 of their plan for net zero, it says there in black and white that their plan provides a better than 50% chance of staying below 1.5. And that's quite carefully worded. a better than 50% chance. They're not saying 51% or 52% or 60%. They're saying it's a better than 50% chance. It's not very much over 50%. They're basically presenting us with a toss of the coin for staying below 1.5 degrees. That's what the current net zero by 2050 plan is. And so the bill, and I don't know what the current percentage would be if we kept the actual 1.5 budget without the nets, but I don't think that's acceptable, tossing the coin on our future. The bill also pulls in the need to actively restore nature. And so it will bring to the fore the context of soil health, biodiversity, conservation, active management of the carbon sinks along the UK's entire supply chains. And so in the way that it looks at consumption emissions being counted within our carbon budget, it also looks at the supply line impact of the manufacturing goods that we're importing. So it seeks a process of planetary repair along with mobilisation to reduce carbon emissions. How am I doing for time, Kate? So again, you're muted.
You've got 2 more minutes.
Oh, two more minutes. So how are we going to do this? What's the strategy? So what we're doing is we've set up, there's a number of grassroots campaigns that have set up across the country. So the strategy is based on constituency campaigning, people getting in touch with their local MP. We keep getting in touch. Looking at getting councils to pass motions at the local level. So there's pressure at constituency level. And then we've also got a number of allies who've come on board. Greenpeace, for example, UK, are supporting the bill. The Beavers Trust, the Ecology Building Society. We're going to talk to the Association of British Insurers next week. We're getting some of those trusted commentators on board. Oh, the head of engineering at Bath University and Cardiff University is supporting the bill. We're getting those trusted commentators on board. So when we go and talk to the MPs, we can say, look, these people think this is credible. You know, what exactly is it you're opposed to? And as the MPs come on board, they start putting pressure on the government. So it's a squeezing at constituency level and also at national and trusted commentator level. And that's really why it's really important that at Greenwich level, at York level, that campaign with regard to your MP continues. So it becomes a dialogue and it becomes an ongoing campaign. And there's other people you can pull into that as well, like your local faith groups and the various climate action groups that are set up in the way that Oxford has done really very successfully. And Oxford ended up having a Zoom call with the 6 MPs in Oxford and what do they call themselves? Greener Oxford or the Oxford Bill Alliance. But they got all 6 of their MPs to come to a Zoom call about the CEE bill. So there's a number of ways that from at constituency level. And I'm going to finish there.
Thank you. So without further ado, we'll pass over to Robert.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm just going to show a few slides as part of my short presentation today. So here we go. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk today about the CE bill. Biofuel Watch is a small UK and US NGO campaigning against big bioenergy. Our current focus is now on electricity produced from biomass, looking at organisations like Drax and others in the UK who are importing large quantities of wood from other countries to produce so-called renewable electricity. We really welcome the CEE bill. We think it's absolutely right that there should be an update to the 2008 Climate Change Act. And I was following the points that Sarah was just making, and I totally agree with all of those. But we have a real concern that the way the text in the bill is drafted legitimises, in our view, further expansion of bioenergy through negative emissions technologies. Sarah used the term nets, so I'll switch back to that in a second. Specifically, we're concerned about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which makes bioenergy even more damaging because it's less efficient, and because it's bigger scale, it requires more land. So this is why we campaign against bioenergy. I'm not going to go through every single point on there, but to pick out some of the key things. First of all, it actually increases emissions compared to, burning gas or burning coal, particularly when we're, when we're thinking about electricity. It's involved in habitat destruction, which is obviously something we want to avoid. And really, we think it's a free pass of business as usual, because sectors of the economy like aviation are very keen, obviously, to decarbonise, but their route to decarbonising typically includes bioenergy. As I'll mention a bit later on in this presentation, it's now including the suggestion that their residual emissions by 2050 should be covered off by using BECCS, in other words, negative emissions technology. So this is something we did many, many years ago, back in 2011. We raised an early day motion, which was sponsored by Caroline Lucas, to ask that the UK government stopped its plan to subsidise biofuels, and particularly biofuels used in power stations and biomass used in power stations. So you see the highlighted red wording I put there. Concerned that existing biofuel sustainability criteria are weak and assessment for compliance is entirely dependent on self-reporting from fuel suppliers, and that a focus on bioenergy could distract attention from genuine ways of combating climate change. Now, we've spent the years since 2011 trying to fight against the expansion of bioenergy. We weren't successful in getting government to drop the idea of subsidising big bioenergy. We haven't been successful in stopping the use of biofuels in petrol and diesel, but we have been successful in stopping a number of actual power stations going through because we've raised some doubts about their credibility and their viability. So, we have been doing this for some time, and, we're quite keen, we're happy to see Caroline Lucas sponsoring a new bill, but we're, as I said earlier, we're concerned about the inclusion of text in the bill that could lead us to having more bioenergy installed in this country. So this is the text of concern in the bill. I'm hoping this is still the current version, which I took off the website a few days ago. So we've got clauses in there that say we may carbon sequestration by negative emissions technologies where emissions cannot be eliminated in specific sectors, and also where the deployment of these would not lead to critical impacts in the UK and abroad. So we think this is slightly at odds with the text that's on the front of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill webpage, which has got statements like, those in power not to depend on future technology to save the day, and we don't depend on technology to save the day as an excuse for inaction. So while we totally support what the bill is trying to achieve, we are still concerned and rather confused about why nets, and the nets that we're particularly concerned about is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, why those things are still included in the text in the bill. Now, we've heard that the science requires, or the science supports the idea that we should be using nets and BECCS to achieve or safeguard 1.5 degrees. Now I just pulled out this is a screen, this is a page from the IPCC 2018 special report called the Summary for Policymakers, which was the thing that talked about what we need to do globally to get to 1.5 degrees. And you see there are what they call 4 pathways there, with tons of CO2 changing over time. These are the annual emissions globally, to get down to, you know, a good chance. I can't remember whether it's the 50% or just over 50% chance of achieving a 1.5 safeguard. But if you look at the 4 pathways, pathway 1, P1, talks about a scenario where we've got lower energy demand up to 2050 with rising living standards, especially in the global south, a downsized energy system. And the key thing here is afforestation is the only carbon dioxide removal option considered. Neither fossil fuels with CCS nor BECCS are used. So we don't think it's completely right to say that the science says we must have BECCS and nets in order to achieve 1.5 degrees, because this pathway, which I haven't looked at personally in great deal of detail, must be a reasonably worked out pathway to achieve 1.5 degrees. So one of the big issues with bioenergy, of course, is it requires an enormous amount of land. And this is because photosynthesis to grow plants and trees is incredibly efficient in terms of converting sunshine and CO2 into plant matter. This is a screenshot here from the same IPCC document, where they've got the 4 pathways across the top and various characteristics of those pathways. Now, the one I've highlighted in white near the bottom says how much land area is required for bioenergy crops in 2050. And this is in millions of kilometres squared. So these are big numbers. And down the side here, I've just calculated or looked up what each of those pathways means in terms of land area for bioenergy crops. So pathway 1, the one that had no reliance at all on nets, is managing to make do with a land area which is roughly equivalent to Kyrgyzstan, or just about most of the UK. When you move on to the next ones, you see that we get to pathway 2 is the whole of Pakistan, pathway 3 is the whole of Argentina, and pathway 4 is most of Australia. That's just dedicated to growing bioenergy crops in order to achieve the carbon reductions for 2050. So there are obviously loads and loads of different ways of achieving 1.5 safeguard by 2050. Now, the third issue with bioenergy and carbon capture is the feasibility or not of carbon capture itself. The pathway P4 that I've just talked about with the huge land area requires a cumulative carbon capture of up to 1,200 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2100. But how realistic is it that we're going to get to that sort of level when the first commercial CO2 injection project in 1972, and since then we've only stored 260 megatons of carbon dioxide, not gigatons, that's megatons. And in pathway P4, they're looking to move from the 260 we've already stored to 1,200 megatons or gigatons by 2100. That's 15 gigatons per year, or 40 megatons per day. For those people who know the numbers, the 260 megatons that's been stored in CCS since 1972, that's not even a whole year's worth of emissions currently from the UK. So that's globally, we're talking about trying to build that infrastructure and build the market mechanisms that will pay people to build that infrastructure and to pay for the storage. So all of these things are possible. It's a question of how much belief do you have that they are really going to happen. So I think we should be planning for something that doesn't require such a massive, massive amount of engineering. Now, we're not alone in having concerns about net zero and bioenergy with carbon capture. This is a report from a few weeks ago. I think it was October 2020. So we've got Action Aid here, we've got Friends of the Earth International making comments like, most net zero climate targets are effectively driving a form of carbon colonialism. Now, we agree with that because most of the bioenergy systems and solutions that we use in this country are actually running off feedstock that's come from abroad. We've got palm oil from Indonesia and Asia, we've got soya from South America, we've got wood from Estonia, Russia, and Canada and North America. So they're all imported to the UK. The vast bulk of our bioenergy comes from abroad. And here's just a quick thing from the same report, how net zero disguises the amount of actual emissions. So all of these three cases produce net zero, but you've got to think which is the most sensible in terms of ecological impacts and social impacts and overall environmental impacts. Obviously, it's number one, isn't it? You certainly don't want to go down the scale and keep on, emitting more and then having to draw down more. Okay, and there's just a quick quote from their report as well. The net zero term is being used by a majority of polluting governments and corporations to evade responsibility, disguise climate inaction, and in some cases even to scale up fossil fuel extraction, burning and emissions. There's a case in point in the UK where, if anybody follows this, the main strategy for replacing home heating gas boilers is actually to make hydrogen from natural gas, and that is only going to be carbon neutral or low carbon if they invest in a huge amount of CCS. So there is a big industry move to press for more CCS so that the gas producers, the fossil fuel producers can stay in business, and we don't actually get off fossil fuel. So we'll end up with, the threat is that fracking will return because we'll run out of North Sea gas, but it'll be okay because it's been converted to hydrogen. So all these things are connected. So bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, we think that is a more aggressive version of bioenergy, requires even more land than we currently are, being forced to give to bioenergy. It's an unproven engineering and commercial model, and it's a free pass for the fossil fuel industry, agriculture, and for aviation. I'll go on to talk about aviation in a second. So this is what big bioenergy looks like. It's not friendly, it's not biodiverse, it's monocultures. And in large cases, it's drenched with chemicals in order to increase the yield. This is a couple of pictures here from North Carolina, near the pelleting plant, one of the pelleting plants is owned by Drax. They're cut on the right-hand side. And this is so-called forestry residues being taken into the pelleting plant on the left-hand side. They don't look to me very much like residues. They look to me like most of a real tree. So the problem with land, this is agricultural land globally. You can see over time that obviously the amount of land that's been put aside or used for agriculture has risen quite steeply, but it's plateaued. That's basically, my take on it is basically because we are running out of land that we can turn over to farming, because there's more competition with urban land, there's desertification, there's droughts affecting the viability of land. And so we haven't got more land to keep allocating to bioenergy. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at forestry, the percentage of land under forestry is in a steady decline, which is a problem for our carbon sink, isn't it? And we don't want to carry on doing this by extracting more wood and burning it. There's a comment about desertification. So there are 12 million hectares of land lost every year to desertification, and that's impacting, the viability of food production, which at the moment is only really being sustained by increased intensification and use of chemicals. As the population grows from 7 billion to 10 billion, we really do need all of the agricultural land we've got and stop taking more for bioenergy. Now, the bill mentions certain hard to treat sectors and says, if necessary, they can use nets and BECCS to offset their residual emissions. Now, the NFU published something, I think it was last year, saying how they were going to get to net zero by 2040. And in that document, they say this is how they're going to do it. They're going to save 11.5 million by productivity and reducing their own emissions. They're going to save 9 million megatons by storing carbon on farmland, but they're going to save, or they're going to offset 26 million tons of carbon dioxide a year by having BECCS. Now that 26 million tons a year is exactly twice what the whole of Drax power station emits at the moment from burning wood every year. So what that's saying is to offset the residual emissions from agriculture, we need to build another 2 Drax power stations and connect them up to carbon capture storage and pipe it all out to the North Sea. Now, aviation I mentioned, this is something I came across recently, another report about how to make aviation carbon neutral. The researchers concluded the most favourable option is continuing powering aircraft with fossil fuels, but then remove the associated CO2 emissions from the atmosphere using CO2 carbon capture plants. That's not capturing the carbon on the planes, it's capturing them by putting lots of bioenergy into power stations and then piping that away to the North Sea for storage. So, I think Sarah mentioned Kevin Anderson. He signed a letter last December saying carbon offsetting, net zero targets, not particularly in favour of those. There's a few comments there. Overly optimistic that technological solutions for carbon dioxide removal will solve the problem. Irresponsible to base net zero targets on the assumption that uncertain technologies will compensate for present day emissions, etc.
Robert, I'm just going to interrupt you there and say you've got about a minute to wrap up.
I'm wrapping up now. Thanks, Kate.
Fantastic.
Now, we've written our own report on negative emissions technologies, which I think came out also in December. So you can look that up on our website. Please do have a look if you're interested in getting further information on this. And right at the bottom here, I put a link. You don't need to write the link down. You'll find it on our website. It's a link to responding to the government's current consultation or call for evidence on greenhouse gas removals. So it'd be wonderful if people could at least look at responding to that. Thank you very much. I'll take questions and look forward to discussing this further. Thanks.